This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the amazing Dr. Regina Bradley, award-winning writer and researcher of the Black American South. She is an alumni of the Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellow Hutchins Center at Harvard, an associate professor of English and African Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University. She's the faculty editor for Southern Cultures Journal and co-host of the critically acclaimed Southern hip hop podcast, Bottom of the Map, with music journalist Christina Lee. She is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South. Which was named one of the books all Georgians should read in 2022. She's also the editor of An Outkast Reader, collection of essays about Outkast, and the co-editor alongside Mark Anthony Neal and Murray Forman of the third edition of the That's That Joint Hip Hop Studies Reader. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Bradley. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
The summer went by too fast. The summer I don't like that.
I was looking at my syllabus today, like I kind of need to start this. But I want to start by asking you, how you came to Black Studies. I know that you have your PhD in English, but you have your master's in African American Studies. So, one, how did you come to Black Studies? But also, what do you think about like the way that those two disciplines kind of blend together?
So what had happened was I went to the unsinkable Albany State University, and they didn't have a Black Studies program there. But my honors advisor, Dr. Ontario Wooden, got a call out to people, was like, I think you need to get out the South. And I think you need to pursue something in Africana studies because you have this interest in Black folks and why Black folks exist and do what they do. And I was like, first of all, what's Black studies? Like, what is that? So I did my research, and he was an alum from Indiana University, Bloomington. And I decided to apply just to see what happened. I didn't think I was going to get in or anything like that. I was like, where is Indiana on the map? If you show me a map in Indiana, I couldn't show you where it was. That's how, kind of foreign it was to me in a way. So I got accepted. I get there, and it's just this amazing program about like all different things. It was like all Black everything: Black women, Black writers, Black history, Black politics. Why do you think you're Black? It was such an amazing experience. That I was really thankful that I trusted Dr. Wooden and kind of trusted myself to go and try something new in the Midwest of all places. I was like, you would think that I was like, oh, I'm learning about being Black in the Midwest and I'm from the South. And it was really pursuing graduate studies there that helped me to really think more deeply and thoroughly about Southern Blackness. Like my thesis that shall not be read, is about Southern Black masculinity and hip hop and the Black Power movement. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't pursue Black Studies as a master's degree program. So shout out to Indiana University, Bloomington's African American and African Diaspora Studies program. Proud alumna, very proud alumna. In terms of, how it relates to English, I mean, unfortunately, English and literary studies is still considered to be hella white. Can I say that? Okay. I mean, it's extremely white, right? And even when we think about canonical studies of like African American literature, a lot of folks stop at like the 1980s as like the last significant contemporary moment. But being able to combine Africana studies with my interest in literature allowed me to kind of think more thoroughly about what the significance was of Blackness in a moment where Blackness wasn't supposed to register in the same way as it had in previous generations and decades, but it was registering. And the question was how? So having a background in Africana studies allowed me to ask those type of questions, and to not fall to the, kind of traditionalism of English. Because I don't think I would have made it if I would have been a traditional English scholar.
Yeah. So I want to go back real quick because you've mentioned that, coming from the South to Indiana and thinking about Southern Blackness, like it helped you to really think about that distinction or that identity, right?
Yeah.
So I would love to hear more about that as someone who is from Michigan. So from being from the Midwest, but having obviously family who is from the South.
Mm-hmm.
What was that distinction and like, how did you think about that?
I can remember the moment almost. It was like my aha moment, my Ellisonian moment, if you will, where it was like, I was sitting in a seminar about Black political consciousness. It was like Black politics. And we were just having a conversation about regions and like how different regions have different stereotypes and different things associated with it. And my professor was like, take Regina, for example. And I was like, wait, you don't have to call me out like this. And it's like, she's from the South, but you wouldn't know how smart she was based on how she sounded. And I was like, hold on, wait a minute. So I was like, why are you calling me out for my accent? He was like, that's exactly what I'm trying to get y'all to get at. Is like Southerners have particular accents. We have particular experiences. And then I really started to think about it when I took a class with Dr. Portia Maltsby. It was a Black pop music seminar class. And we were having these conversations again about region. And I'm like, folks refuse to engage the South. And I'm like, what's up with that? Like we were talking about hip hop, you know what I'm saying? And most of the scholarship was talking about in New York, it did this, and the West Coast, it did that. And I'm like, well, what about the people that I'm listening to in my car, like right now? Like, what about the South? And that was a really special class for me because, not only did it have, other future great scholars like Fredera Hadley and Langston Collin Wilkins in it along with me. And one was from Texas and the other one was from Florida. We were like, what's up with that? What's up with the South? But, Dr. Mosby was like, well, what are you going to do about it? So she gave the rallying cry. So being able to leave the South allowed me to really think about myself as a Southerner and how the region influenced how I saw the world, how I saw myself, how I saw, others. And that's a part I feel of Africana studies, right? Is the identity agency that's associated with, where you're from. Like hyperlocalism is such a significant part, I think, of how we understand what identity and even performative identity looks like. And unfortunately for the South, there's still so many stigmas associated with Southern Blackness. The idea that Southern Black folks are supposed to feel traumatized all the time and victims, and we think backwards. And, every time we see a white person, we cross the street, all these kind of crazy things that Southern Black folks are supposed to do. And that's not necessarily the case. And then the understanding that all Southern Black folks are the same is something that still makes me like wonder, like, what is it that we're doing that folks think like, oh, if you're from the South, it's just this one kind of like monogamous space, Black South. In the same way, like even in the same way, if you think about the Midwest, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a dearth of scholarship about Black Midwesternness that we're still playing catch up, right? And I just feel like being able to think about these things from these different perspectives, these interdisciplinary perspectives, I guess, is useful in complicating not only my own identity, but how I, what the world looks like according to me as a Southerner.
Thank you. That was really interesting. It was. Cause like I think about one, like I teach a Black culture class now, and so I assign the politics of Black joy, which highlights like
the Lindsay Stewart book.
Yeah. So like how there are these stereotypes about Southern Blackness, and like we're still playing into them, even though that's not the case. Like, there needs to be more representation, there needs to be more perspectives, there needs to be acknowledgement of all of the things that happened in the South in the past.
After the civil rights movement.
Right.
I
And like, it
agree
didn't
with
just
that.
stop there. Like, Southern Blackness didn't stop at the civil rights movement.
It didn't. I'm glad you said it, not me this time.
But the ways that we, and like the collective we, and like everybody in academia, but how we think about these things, and even in the field of Black studies, and the necessity of having those interdisciplinary perspectives and lenses to view these things. What do you, so I know that you have your PhD in English, but like, what other disciplines or fields do you think are integral to not just your work, but thinking about Black studies and Blackness?
I feel like a broken record, but regional studies is important to Black studies. So for me, I feel like my relationship to Southern studies is complicated, because Southern studies is dominantly white. You know what I'm saying? And this is what the South means to white folks. And I'm like, a lot of the folks that you uplift weren't thinking about Black folks in the same way that Black Southerners think about Black folks. So I'm like, that there's that element of it that I think about. I also think about feminist studies. For me, I think about Black feminism studies. As a Southern Black woman, I feel like Southern Black women's perspectives are just as important and probably provide a really critical insight that's often underlooked or underappreciated, especially when you're thinking about more contemporary issues like hip hop and pop culture. Especially in this particular moment where you see so many Southern Black women that are on the scene and changing the game, and everybody from Meg to Carisha to Flo Millie to Glorilla. You know what I mean? It's still 95 degrees. It's not Friday, but it's still hot. But I think that those are some of the elements that I think about and intersect, because there are frameworks already in place, and I feel like what Black studies challenges us to do is to connect the dots that are already there in new and interesting ways, so that we don't fall into the trap that Black experiences are monolithic, or that Black experiences are only supposed to go a particular way. And the academy is not necessarily slow, but I mean, it takes time for these things to pick up. You know what I'm saying? And the way that a lot of Black studies scholars intersect their interests with the tradition, I think, of Black studies is really amazing. And I'm so excited to see a lot of the younger scholars, the come up scholars, if you will, starting to really question that and break it apart and put it together in really new and interesting ways, right? Like having conversations about porn studies. How does that relate to Black studies, right? Or having conversations about politics. We have, a woman of color, a Black woman running for president of the United States, and folks don't quite know how to articulate what that looks like, both the criticisms as well as what she's doing right. You know what I'm saying? So I think that it's interesting to see how all of this is unfolding in real time. And a lot of folks are resorting back to those particular moments where Black studies was being called upon to be able to discuss those things.
How do you see, I mean, being very much related to it, but how do you see hip hop studies as providing a lens or framework to be able to discuss these things as well?
I think we need to we need to stop collapsing hip hop into just rap. Like, I think that's a big thing. Hip hop is a culture, therefore hip hop studies needs to be cultural studies. It's amazing to me that Black Noise came out in 1994, 30 years ago, and was doing all of this amazing work. And that kind of opened up the door, kicked the door open. And then you get, Joan Morgan in 1999 with this idea of hip hop feminism. How do younger Black women and women of color fit into conversations about hip hop? How do we love hip hop when hip hop doesn't love us back? Right? Like asking these these types of questions, and that opens up for like the Crunk Feminist Collective that comes out around like 2003, 2004. So like hip hop has always been, it wasn't just a soundtrack, it was also like a system of beliefs, a cultural system that was like, this is how we see the world. I mean, my biggest complaint again is region. Like I feel like I'm a broken angry record. But I mean, it's significant. What happens in New York is different than what happens in Georgia or Mississippi or California or Ohio or Chicago. You know what I'm saying? So it's like there needs to be language to articulate that. And we're just now starting to see this erupt. So part of my my platform, I guess, as a Southern hip hop scholar is to challenge younger scholars and even the scholars, colleagues, to be like, I need you to think about this from a different perspective. Like, why are we only thinking about like everything that happens in one place? This is supposed to be the be all end all. And hip hop hasn't had a New York area code in years, decades. You know what I'm saying? She travels. She got multiple phones. She got passports now. You know what I'm saying? So I think that, the challenge is articulating a system of beliefs, a framework that allows for the complexities of hip hop to shine through in the same way, that it did before. And hip hop studies is very much Black studies. You know what I'm saying? Like I think it's that and more, right? Like, hip hop isn't just a Black export of the United States anymore. I mean, like it's an international phenomenon. Like, I got friends who are sending me Gregorian monks chanting the trap music. Like it's a whole different thing. And then there's this interest in trap culture. You know what I mean? That I'm with it. Like I'm down for it. But at the same time, I want to also make sure that folks understand that's not the be all end all of Southern hip hop. It's just like what folks are interested in, unfortunately, at the moment. But honestly, I don't think trap studies are going anywhere. It's no time soon. I mean, like there's still so much stuff we have to uncover. But I do think hip hop studies needs to backtrack and start to collect some of these other areas that are being underrepresented to kind of show the complexity of what hip hop culture can do, not only on a local level, but a national level, international level. I kind of do these rants on Twitter every once in a while. It's like things that I'd want to read, but that I'm not going to write. And one of my biggest ones is like, I'm ready for the Midwest now. Like we're hearing from the South now. We're hearing from the East Coast. We've heard from the West Coast. I'm ready for the Midwest. Like, where is the discussion of Bone Thugs and Harmony and Gothicism? Like, where is where's the connection between funk culture in Ohio and like Twista? You know what I'm saying? Like, I need to know. I need to see these things. And I think that, the best way to do that is through an interdisciplinary framework. And that's exactly what hip hop and Black studies is capable of doing.
I would agree. I think that would be very interesting. And I too would like to read that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to write it, but I'll read it and teach it.
We'll be on the syllabus. What, so as a teacher, right? Because I know one of the main times that she went viral was about your Outkast class.
Yeah.
So as a teacher, what is it that you feel like we should be doing in the Black studies classroom or even like the hip hop studies classroom? Like what pedagogically makes the difference in our classrooms?
I mean, what I'm like is I'm in this weird place right now pedagogically because like the students I was teaching when the Outkast class first dropped in like 2017 are different than this last class. I just taught the Outkast class this past spring, and it was like the demographics, the dynamics were totally different. Like it was really, it made me confront, like there were things that I had to like go back and teach to make sure students understood. So like, it's not just us listening to Outkast albums and deciding who's the best and which I mean, there's conversations that happen like that, but it's a larger conversation about like, what was going on in Atlanta on Southern Playlistic drop and like stuff like that. So it was having to meet students where they were, because a lot of my students had never, I had a couple of students who had never heard of Outkast, which just hurt my spirit. But I was like, it's okay. We're here to learn. It's okay. Or they started with, Speaker Box and The Love Below and had never heard of the rest of their catalog. So it's kind of like, I need to take you from scratch to start. The pandemic has impacted, how I approach students in the classroom. I feel like it is making me more empathetic, but at the same time, I'm also pushing back against this understanding of the classroom as like a customer service space. Like I had a student tell me like, I'm the customer, and I'm like, no, you're the student. Like I had to, shut that down real quick. So it's like, how do you get students to step out of their comfort zones? And part of that for me when I was teaching that class is asking them what they're listening to. That was the easiest way to get them to open up and be like, yeah, I'm listening to this, and that. And then revisiting like these artists that they're talking about and asking them to put them in conversation with an Outkast or put them in conversation with, a T.I. or a Goody Mob. You know what I'm saying? And that kind of like, it had their aha moments, like the light bulb came on, like what they were listening to didn't just all of a sudden happen. Like one of the things that I feel like not just me, but a lot of professors and teachers are pushing back against is this perception that these popular cultural moments happen in these vacuums, like they all of a sudden come out of nowhere. And it's like, no, there's history behind that. So I think that's been the biggest challenge for me is not teaching on the assumption that students know the historical background in order to understand and appreciate what the cultural significance is of who they're listening to and why.
Any specific things that have been like really helpful in making those connections more clear for students?
I do a lot of mind mapping in class, like where like start with one thought or idea bubble and it kind of just expands and connects to these different places. Like we'll take up the whole board, which is it's really cool to see. But it's also like, this isn't just me lecturing. This is you and I in conversation. I feel like making sure students understand that they are in conversation with me as the professor. And I'd be like, professor, y'all just gonna sit here and listen, which a lot of students are kind of expecting. It's like, I want you to, talk to me, tell me what's on the exam, and that's it. And I'm like, no, there's this thing, it's called critical thinking that we're going to work on, that we're going to talk about. So I use that a lot. And something else that I've done too, like the first 5 minutes of class is let students kind of skim what we're talking about for the day. That actually really helps to kind of go back to like, okay, I give you 5 minutes. Skim or try to read what we're talking about so that you can contribute to class today. And that has also opened up the conversation. But ultimately, I just want to make sure that students know that this is a learning space. This is a safe space. And I feel like part of that comes from my background and from my experiences taking Black Studies classes is like being able to ask questions that seem stupid. At least in my mind, like, am I stupid for asking this question? When the reality of it is probably like half of your classmates are probably thinking or wondering the same thing. So establishing a safe space to ask questions, no matter, how trite or trivial they may seem, has opened up the door for me to allow for really rich and connecting conversations between myself and students.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Not only like as a lecturer, but in thinking about like the ways that my department is rethinking teaching and pedagogy and things like that. So I really appreciate that. So in the interest of time, I do want to make sure that I get in these other two questions, just two questions I have left. One, what interests you most about the past of Black studies in both critical senses and like excited senses?
I feel like it's both. Like, I mean, like I think about a couple of things. Like, I wonder, because technically like Black Studies as a formal program started over at San Francisco State back, on the West Coast. Like, I wonder again, what that region thing does, man. Like, because it worked in Northern California, what would that have looked like if it would have took place in like a rural part of the United States? You know what I'm saying? I always play that. I always wonder about that. I've always been fascinated with Black studies as it relates to Black women. I find myself revisiting that with this new project that I'm working on. Is like, what did Black women have to say about being Black? What does it mean? You know, how do you theorize Blackness, right? This idea that you know, it works for Black men in this particular way, but it doesn't necessarily work for Black women in the same way. In terms of trends, I mean, like, I'm really fascinated with this idea of some folks who are still pushing for like this post-Black, like, I mean, like, and even what that looks like in like popular culture, you know what I mean? I mean, like, Pharrell was talking about, you know, I think he said he was the new black or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's just all of these different discussions like, oh, I don't necessarily identify as Black. Now, I had a couple of students tell me they don't identify as African American, they just identify as Black. It's really fascinating to see like how folks refer to their Blackness and their Black experiences, because at one point, you know, you would have got punched in the mouth, you call somebody Black, and then you would have got punched in the mouth, you call somebody Negro or Afro American. So it's interesting, the cyclical like naming. How do we name ourselves? Really is fascinating for me too. I'm also interested in the ways that Black studies is putting its paw prints on other movements. Like, I'm working on like a collection of personal essays about growing up in Southwest Georgia. And one of the chapters that's bringing me a lot of joy and frustration at the same time is thinking about sexual politics and sex and what does that look like? And, you know, what would that look like through a Black studies lens? You know, there's folks there are younger scholars who are out here, like Zalika Ibaromi, for example, who is thinking about like porn studies and thinking about like, or critical porn studies and thinking about like, what does sex look like? What does consent look like? Like, there's these things that we not necessarily take for granted, but that we think about that could be really useful in thinking about some of these academic terms and terminology. So like, you could take something like respectability politics, right? And not necessarily in the same way that Evelyn Brooks Higginbottom is talking about Black church women, but now it's taking on its own thing. And in the South, folks will turn off if you say politics respectability. But if you say ladylike, the ears perk up like, oh, I know what that is, right? Like, fine. So like, how do we make Black studies consumable, right? Because I honestly feel like, you know, Black studies wasn't meant to just be connected to the academy. Like, I feel like it's not just supposed to be in the academy and stay in the academy. Like, it's supposed to be part of community. And I think that it's finding its way and trying to think about what community looks like, and how to reapply or apply these theories and ideas and experiences to the everyday. And that's what I'm really excited to see.
So that made me think of something else. So speaking of community, right? I was looking at your acknowledgments page in Chronicling Stankonia, in all of the different communities that thanked for being a part of that process. And that was one of I actually had a conversation with my sister about like what different people's acknowledgments look like. Mm-hmm. Like how you have like some disciplines or some fields or some traditions where it's more like straightforward. I thank my family, I thank God, I thank my editors, period. Right? And then you have other people who do acknowledge and name the community that they're coming out of and the members of that community explicitly. So what do you think is the importance of the naming of not just like what we call ourselves and how we identify, but like what of the individuals who we encountered along the way?
You know, like everybody, they don't talk to me about the book. That's what most folks talk to me about, like your acknowledgments though. My roll call, if you will, the roll call. I think I spent just as much time on that acknowledgments as I did on parts of the book, because it was so important for me to like make sure that people's names were in print. One, I didn't know if I was going to be able to do this again. And two, it was just, I wanted to show that I am not a sole ember. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that the academy is such a lonely place, and it kind of forces us at times to be so individual that we forget where we forget sometimes even just for a minute where we come from. So that acknowledgement was more for me than for the people that were in it. It was a way for me to acknowledge I'm still a Benny girl. I'm still part of these different experiences, in addition to my traditional, thank you to my editors, thank you to the press, thank you to my department. But I was like, yeah, I mean, like this Southern hip hop thing is acknowledgement, right? Like, how can I say that I'm a hip hop head or a Southern hip hop head and not acknowledge the people who allowed me to get here, and keep me going? Like, I wonder what the acknowledgments are going to look like for this next book. You know what I'm saying? Because if they're probably similar, I guess. I mean, I keep notes. Like, if there's somebody who's helped me out, I make sure that I put a note. I have like notes in my phone, people to thank. So it helps me to stay up. I mean, like, some of those names had been on that list for years. I first got the contract for Chronicling Stankonia in 2015, and it was published in 2021. So there were some folks who were there for years that were waiting on that acknowledgement. But again, I mean, like, community is just so important. It's so important to me, because it helps me to really sustain my engagement with the academy, to sustain my research agenda, because it's a reminder that, the same way I tell my students, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like, folks are here to lift you up. And I always try to lift up the folks coming up behind me in the same way that I was lifted and supported and loved. I try to make sure that I love and support the folks coming up behind me in the same way, because now I'm in a position to be able to do so. So it's a love practice. I mean, it's just a love practice.
I appreciate that answer. And because I was reading it like, this is a quintessential list of people, but also like it reflects how small certain communities can be. Because when you think of, especially when you think about the intersections of people who do Black studies or are Black studies adjacent or are Black in academia, like it's about that big. And you see the same names and the same people and the same communities come up again and again. And that's what really struck me. I was like, oh, I know them and them and them. This is it's all so interconnected. So, last question. What interests and excites you most about the future of Black studies?
This is going to sound really vague, but I mean it with my most sincerest heart. I'm ready for the youngins. Like, I'm ready for these young folks who are coming up in here who are disrupting everything. We're just like, no, we don't want to talk about respectability politics. We're going to talk about disrespectability politics. We're going to talk about the ratchet. We're going to talk about this. We're going to do this. And I'm just like, I want all of that. Like, I just think that, that's what makes, I mean, in a way, that's what makes Black studies is disruption, right? Like, it's disruption of the status quo. And I'm super excited to see these younger generations of scholars who are like taking some of these extremely traditional questions and turning them on their ear and turning them on, especially like, early like 19th, 20th century. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm a contemporary scholar, so I have interest in like the last 30, 40 years. You know what I'm saying? But it's like, it's interesting to see folks asking these questions about like white women slave owners. Why don't we talk about them? Or, how did enslaved people find joy? Like, I think I'm super excited about these Black joy studies that are starting to come up, right? It's not like being Black is such a traumatizing experience. How do we navigate the joyfulness of being Black? You know what I mean? What does that look like? What language can we use to articulate what that is? So just, like asking the questions that folks or that make folk kind of like sit up a little bit or make them a little uncomfortable, right? Like the discomfort of not knowing what's going to happen next is super exciting. And I really look forward to seeing how these younger scholars start asking some of these questions. It's weird when I say younger scholars because like in my mind, I was just in grad school like 5-6 years ago. No, it's been way longer than that. I feel like I'm a middle management scholar now. So it's like, thinking about this younger generation who are finding their truths and speaking their truths to power and pushing back against these kind of like canonized and canonical texts and beliefs and experiences, is only going to do good for Black studies. Like, in the same way that, I tell my students that Blackness is not monolithic. The way that we study and engage Blackness should be equally as non-monolithic. And that's what's happening right now. And I think that's really exciting.
I agree. One of the when we did the interview with Michigan State's African American and the African Studies Department, Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown described Black studies undisciplined. Like it doesn't fit. Like we're going against it. Or she said anti-discipline, if you're talking about the Rihanna influence. But I agree. I think that that's really an important and interesting space for it to go. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts? Anything you want to leave?
I mean, we out here and we working, and the work is just gonna keep going up and up from here. And I'm just super excited to support and see how Black studies continues to define and redefine itself as a vessel of Blackness and Black experiences.
Thank you.